Well, hello. This is my submission for Stefan's competition for the Pissaladière knives. You know, I'm really tempted to say hello everybody, because the other person whose channel I really enjoy is Mr. Dagon's. But then this is a French recipe, so perhaps it would be better to say bonjour tout le monde. Pissaladière is a pizza-like dish that apparently originated in the south of France, around Avignon, Marseille, Toulon. And I believe the etymology of the word, at least according to Wikipedia, comes from an Occitan word, peix. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. It's a bit like the Catalan word peix, which means fish. Peix salat, pissaladière, salted fish, because it features anchovies. This recipe is a little bit of a cheat, I guess, because I'm not going to make a pizza dough. I'm going to use some ready rolled puff pastry, because it's just absolutely gorgeous. So here are my ingredients to begin with, or at least some of them, and I'll put the recipe, I guess, along with this video if I can. So I've got onions, naturally enough. It's an onion dish. I've got some olive oil and some butter, which I'm going to cook in. The butter adds a touch of richness. It will be decorated with anchovies and black olives, and to help caramelize the onions, there's some brown sugar and some garlic, which adds some extra flavour. And as a matter of fact, there's an ingredient that I've forgotten to put out, which is some star anise, because a little bit of star anise added to onion when you fry it really helps make the flavour a lot richer. It's lovely. Okay, let's start. Well, first I guess I need to choose a knife, and I've got a lot to choose from, and you know, the strange thing is I always end up using the tiny little sabatier rather than the big chef's knife, so that's what I'll get off the shelf. The recipe calls for 3 large onions. I don't have 3 large onions, so I'm using 4 kind of medium ones. Right, I've peeled 3 cloves of garlic, and normally I just put them in whole, because the advantage of doing that is that they fry very, very gently and they kind of caramelize, and then I bring them up and I can just crush them with a fork. They've got a kind of green centre shoot in these ones, and normally when I'm frying them I would cut the garlic clove in half and then take that out, because it can add a bitter touch. So I think what I'm going to do though is leave it in, cook them whole, and then when I come to crush it, it might just make that a bit more difficult. I might need to cut that to take out the centre. So meanwhile, I've got, if I lift you up, take you over here, I've got some star anise. I've got the oven on a kind of medium heat, about like that. I've got a boatload of onions in my pan, which I'm just going to turn around and toss in oil. And then it's really just a question of adding the garlic cloves, adding the star anise. I'll cook it for a little tiny bit, and then add some demerara sugar, and then you just really cook it for an hour in total. After about half an hour, I add the salt, pepper and some thyme, just a kind of pinch of thyme, and then you keep stirring until they're a kind of walnut brown, or at least a light walnut brown, by which time they're done. So I'm going to stop the recording and we'll come back later, maybe at the halfway point, after about half an hour. Okay, so this isn't after half an hour at all, but I thought it probably useful to show you that, you know, the onions are all glistening. I put about a tablespoonful of butter in, and probably a little bit more than that of olive oil. As I say, the butter adds richness, but the olive oil makes it be able to get to a slightly higher temperature. Not that that's necessary, because it's only on a medium heat and you mustn't let it catch and burn. It's better to take longer over it and just really slowly get them to caramelize. You mustn't risk, you know, them kind of catching on the edge. You'll give them a slightly bitter taste. The first time I did this, I did it in a big frying pan. In actual fact, doing it in a saucepan is much easier, because I found that if I got the heat right, and I'll clean that off later. If I got the heat right, I could then put the lid on and leave it for maybe about a minute, and then stir, and put the lid on, leave it for about a minute and stir. And then they'd cook slightly even in the steam with the lid on, but not being any risk of burning. Okay, so what's happening here? I'm cooking away. I've got the onions on. I'm just sort of bring you back. It's about 25 minutes these onions have been cooking, and what I'm tending to do, look, is I actually anal enough to put it on a timer on my phone, so I let it cook for a minute, my timer goes off, and then I know it's about time to stir. And I find it a kind of useful thing to do, otherwise you can just stir all the time. But it also means I can adjust the temperature so that when I take the lid off, it's making that kind of sizzling noise, and you can just maybe see at the bottom, it's not catching at all, but it's just kind of nicely sizzling away. It's a kind of relaxing dish to cook because it just takes a time, and you can't get into hurrying it. I won't knock those, it'll make too much noise. You can't get into hurrying it. You just kind of got to relax into the mood. It's a bit like making a risotto, you know. It's going to take you X amount of time. So I poured myself a pastis. I mean, after all, it's meant to be a French recipe, so I thought, I think they call it un jaune, but à ta santé. And I'll bring you back in a little while and show you how we're getting on. Okay, we're about 35 minutes in. Keith Jarrett's just playing in the background, getting kind of ecstatic, and we're about that much pastis into the recipe. I've added, I don't know, probably about 1/4 teaspoonful of salt and maybe a half, 3/4 of a level teaspoonful of thyme, and it's just kind of nicely bubbling away. But at the same time, sorry, every time I reach over I knock the camera. But at the same time, as I say, it's most important it's not catching. It's just kind of frying though rather than boiling, obviously enough. But by the time we've finished, and I'm just going to knock that and that'll go bang on the camera. By the time we've finished, they'll be reduced a little bit more, and they'll be much more of a golden colour. So in the meantime, just to tell you a little more about what's going to happen, to give you an overview, when I'm about 15-20 minutes away, the puff pastry I'm going to put on a tray. In actual fact, that puff pastry is only fractionally bigger than that. You cut a margin around it and blind bake it for about 10 minutes, and that will form the base on which we'll put things. And also in that last minute, what we'll do is we'll chop our olives in half, and the anchovy fillets I'll cut in half because they're thinner and you can make a nicer lattice with them. Okay, so until the next time, I'll just be another, well, for you the time will pass as though no time at all. For me it will be another 20 minutes. Okay, so now we're about 25-30 minutes, and normally the cloves of garlic are still whole but just meltingly tender, and you can just mash them. What I do is I mash them on the edge of my spatula. But I was thinking I might have to get out that centre which had gone green, so I got one out, hence the fork there to mash them with. I got one out and mashed it, and there was no centre because it was just so unctuous and soft. It's a pity I didn't splash out on the camera with a smell attachment, because it just smells divine at this point. But then when I hunted around, there were no more cloves of garlic to be found. They'd all just kind of dissolved in, which is the way you want it. It's much better than chopping them and frying them in this dish because they just go like honey. And even the star anise, that's what remains of it. There were 2 star anises that were in the forms of stars, but they've broken off, and they're kind of stamens or whatever they are have separated. So I'll just fish those out. Although I like having the occasional bite of one because it gives you this intense aniseed flavour, just in deference to the other people who might be eating with me. I've taken those out. So the next step is that the oven's been on warming. I'm going to bake the pastry. Okay, so as I say, I buy it sort of ready rolled, and I would imagine this sort of stuff is available everywhere. Or which knife shall I use? I bought, since we're on a French theme, I bought a couple of table knives from a place in France, and I'll put the address of that on the screen at some point. And they were really cheap. They're not the expensive ones, although nonetheless the handle of that knife is genevrier, which is juniper, and it smells fantastic. It was Stefan's fault, really, because I watched his video on his French knives, and I was just so taken with them that I've just not been able to resist. So let me just get that off there. Right, it's overlapping the edge slightly, so I'll just trim that off. Okay, now the next step is to score just about a kind of little finger's width, and I'll use a much duller blade for that. So I'm just going to score. You can almost go all the way through. And what that's going to do is it's going to form a border, so it'll raise up as it cooks, and then this centre section here we can just kind of press down. It's a bit of a messy business, being flaky pastry, it'll break off, but it doesn't really matter. But it'll just make a bit of a border so that it'll keep the onions in. Okay, so that will go in the oven. Needs to go in for 10 minutes, so I'll just set my trusty clock for 10 minutes. 1, 0 and start. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to get the anchovies and the olives. Obviously halving an olive is hardly a technical process, you probably know how to do that. And the anchovies, I tell you what, I'll just fish one out. But it so happens that having done this a couple of times, and because I was transcribing the recipe, I figured out that I think it needs 9 anchovy fillets in order to crisscross that amount of pastry. And all I do is I just split down the centre. So I've got, in other words, 18 bits, and then that forms a nice crisscross. So that's easy to do. So I'm going to turn off the camera again, and that's what I'm going to get down to. Halving lengthways, I was going to say longitudinally, my anchovy fillets and slicing my black olives. And then by then the pastry will be done and we can assemble. Oh, and my onions I'll just tip to one side, so if there were any extra oil it will just drain to one side, which usually there isn't, but if there is, I then sometimes use that to brush over the top of, or the edges of the pastry, which is also particularly nice. Right, so my pastry has been in the oven for 10 minutes. I'll just take it out. Put it there where you can see it. So you can see, I hope, how much that's sort of raised up. So the next thing we need to do now is just kind of pat that down. I think what I might do is get a new spatula, because the one that I was using is wet with the onions. So as you can see, it kind of breaks slightly, and when we put the onions on, occasionally the onions stick to you, but it's no big deal, it will just taste utterly fantastic. So I'll just push that down fractionally, which is why you needed to score it, and I think perhaps I could have scored it slightly more. Okay, that's flat enough to be able to start putting onions in. So it's funny, no matter how many onions I do, it never seems to be quite enough. So I'm just going to spread those out. There's 4 onions. It's the thing with cooking them for effectively an hour, is that you just don't end up with that many onions. Okay, so I'm going to try and spread these so we've got a nice even coating. I mean, they're very rich, so you don't really want, a 1/4 inch layer of onions, but nonetheless you want a reasonably even layer. And then it's going to go back in the oven. I've got it on about gas 6, and I'm sorry, but I don't know what that is in sort of temperature terms. It might be 180. I'll tell you what, when I come to put the video on the computer for uploading, I'll look it up and I'll put a little overlay or something so that you know how much it is. Oh no, I'll use my nice knife. Yeah, it was a luthier knife. It was seen that review that Stefan did of the Compagnon, except this one was, significantly cheaper. It was from a really nice company, what are they called? BGB, based coincidentally in Arkansas, which is where Stefan's last review was. They were about 13 euros each. I got a plexiglass handle one as well, because I thought having a kind of harlequin set of mixed colours would look really funky. but I really wanted to have juniper one as well. Okay, the next part is we're just going to have cut my anchovies and I'm just going to lay them across. If I did this a bit more, I reckon I might be actually quite good at laying these anchovies across, because I'm not very good at all. Sometimes it turns out just perfectly and you'd think I planned it, and then other times it just doesn't happen and I end up with all sorts of things. In fact, the first time I cooked it was probably the best time in terms of my anchovy laying. But there we go, practice makes perfect, beginner's luck, or whatever it is that the phrase one uses. Okay, so I'll zig those. I'm trying to make a kind of little diamond shape in the middle, because that's where my olives are going to go. Okay, and I've got one olive left over. So now it's the half olives, so that you just effectively fill in the gaps with olives. And then once you've done that, you can brush the edges of the pastry with butter or with the remnants of any oil that you might have in the pan, but you don't necessarily need to. Goes in the oven for a further 10 minutes, you know, just 10-15 minutes, until it kind of looks as though it's sizzling and bubbling, and it looks as though everything's nicely crisped up or homogenized. I say crisped up, the onion doesn't crisp. And then it's just perfect with a light, you know, green salad. Here in England, and I tend to been buying at a local supermarket, and they do a mixture salad that's got rocket, spinach and watercress in, and it's a really lovely mixture of peppery and crispiness. And then a white wine I think is perfect with it, and again a light white wine. I particularly like the Vino Verde because it's got a slight bubble to it, I like the freshness. The French actually call it pétillant, and it's just gorgeous with this. And it's meant to be for 4 people, but in actual fact it's for 2 really, because you cut it in half and sometimes have a little tiny bit left, but it is just so tasty. Well, that's that. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get to kind of try it out yourself, and thank you for watching, and thank you, Stefan, for a lovely channel, and thank you also, just in passing, to Mr. Dagon, whose channel I adore, and I've just had an update from him that he's going away, and so we'll hear a little bit less from him. So thanks to you all. Bye bye.